286. 286. Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, waking mortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, though you're far away. Wonderful story of love, still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, sing from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love, wonderful, 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 wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Jesus provides a rest, wonderful story of love, for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love, wonderful, 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 wonderful story of love. Number 450. 450. This will be a song before our lesson this morning. 450. Let's, if you'd like, let's stand together as we sing. Give me the Bible, star of gladness gleaming, to cheer the wanderer, lone and tempest tossed. No storm can hide that radiant, peaceful evening, since Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible when my heart is broken, when sin and grief have filled my soul with fear. Give me the precious words by Jesus spoken, hold up faith's lamp to show my Savior near. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible, lamp of life immortal, hold up that splendor by the open grave. Show me the light from heaven's shining portal, show me the glory glory, gilding Jordan's way. Give me the Bible, holy message shining. Thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till light shall vanish in eternal day. Be seated, please. And so we sing, asking to give me the Bible, and that's exactly where we go from here, as our word is proclaimed. The Song of Invitation will be 911. 911. Lynn?
I'm glad to be with you again. You still haven't learned to ask somebody else to come. Mike can't get my number out of his phone, I guess. We've had a hard week with Toller. The 4-year-old boy in Stephenville that drowned 8 days ago was a member of Toller. I had his service Friday, and I was leaving the parking lot. I went to church, went to class at Toller this morning. We started at 9, so I go there for class and come here. And his father was pulling in the parking lot when I pulled out. And that's the kind of family they are, kind of character they have. I've known that family for almost 40 years, and so that's a you have no words to say to somebody like that that's gone through that. You just be present and do what you can. I want you to look at 2 Corinthians 12 with me. We're going to get to that in just a minute. I'll kind of introduce it. Paul to the Corinthians, he wrote to them more than he wrote to anybody else. He wrote 2 letters that we have preserved, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There's another letter he refers to as the painful letter that is not preserved for us. And it seems like, if I remember right, there may be reference to even a 4th letter. And so, given the size of it, 1 Corinthians 16 chapters, 2 Corinthians 13 chapters, 29 chapters to a church at one place. That's a lot of volume that he writes to them. And one of the contrasts he gives when he addresses the Corinthians is laid out in chapter 1, which kind of becomes his thesis through both letters. That is, the things that God does, man generally doesn't understand. He talks about the wisdom of God, and he talks about the wisdom of the world. So let me introduce that thought just by reading a couple verses out of 1 Corinthians 1. We'll get to 2 Corinthians 12 in just a minute. He said, since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. And he continues through the end of the chapter. We won't read it all, but it kind of gives you an idea of Paul's thesis for his letters. Is the things that God does generally are completely the opposite of what man would do. And so in 2 Corinthians 12, when Paul comes to almost the end of his discourse with the Corinthians, he kind of plays on this analogy, this irony that exists. Really in chapter 11 is when he starts it. And by this irony illustrates some principles I want to kind of bring home to us this morning. Chapter 12 opens with him talking about these visions that he's seen. He eventually betrays that it's himself because he speaks about himself in the first person. But he saw all these visions in Revelation chapter 12 verse 1 14 years ago. He said, whether it was in the body I don't know, or out of the body I don't know. He said, God knows. Such a man was caught up to the third heaven. And how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I don't know. He was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible words that a man is not permitted to speak. On behalf of such a man I'll boast, but on my own behalf I'll not boast except in regard to my weaknesses. So he saw these things, and he says in verse 7, he gives away the idea that it's him, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. For this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh. So Paul sees things that are beyond the realm of ordinary, beyond the realm of the day-to-day experience that we would think we would go through life with. He sees something he realizes is special. He doesn't have any idea what realm it was in. All he knows is he saw these visions and he had these revelations. And that would tend, especially in light of the Corinthian background, that would tend to produce a lot of boasting. That would tend to make someone, when they had the gift of tongues, they tended to focus on themselves more than anybody else. They would tend to be egotistical. And Paul said, that could be the same with me, but because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, God did something with me to keep me from exalting myself. And He gave me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, to keep me from exalting myself. Paul was not the world's model of the public speaker that sometimes we have today. He was not polished. He was not very powerful in his presence. If Paul walked into a room and somebody said, "This is our preacher for the day," some would kind of cock their eyebrows and say, "Wow, that guy, can he even speak?" Because Paul quotes the Corinthians as saying his personal presence is unimpressive and his speech is contemptible. Generally, a critic will address something legitimate about you and hit you at your weakest point. So I think when the Corinthians say that about Paul, they're pretty well stating what they see on the surface. That if he walks in a room, all the world doesn't hush. The old E.F. Hutton commercials, when E.F. Hutton talks, everybody listens. I know the kids have no idea what we're talking about. Older ones know that. We've lived long enough to see that. When Paul walked in a room, nobody gave any second thought to it. When Paul spoke, they're kind of thinking, "Wow, is this the best we got? Is this the oratorical speaker," which was praised in that century? Paul wasn't a great speaker. And so back in chapter 11, leading up to this, he concluded chapter 11 with his story about all the things he had gone through, all the shipwrecks, the labors, the imprisonments, the 39 lashes he received, verse 24, the 3 times he was beaten with rods, verse 25, the journeys, dangers from robbers, from countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. He's been in hunger and hardship, sleepless nights, hunger and thirst, often without food, cold and exposure. And then he closes the chapter by this story of saying, "In Damascus, I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands." What in the world has that got to do with what Paul has gone through? I'm told that in that time, a sign of valor was the ability of a warrior to scale a wall of a city and get inside. Cities had walls for fortifications. Jericho had that. That's why it was significant that the walls fell when Israel marched around the walls. A soldier's value to his army was the ability to penetrate the enemy fortress, to get over the wall and get in. Paul bragged about just the opposite. He said, "I didn't scale a wall to get in. I was let down in a basket to get out of the city." And he does that in the context of boasting about all the things he had done. So in essence, what he's saying is, I was so weak and so ineffectual. And you got to picture the scene, kind of in a movie scene. A big wall of a fortified city, and at night, here comes something over the top, and you look at it, and it's a big woven basket. And in the basket is a grown individual standing in the basket, coming down inch by inch over the wall. Would anything look more foolish than that? Would anything look more weak than that? Would anyone look more ineffectual than a grown man coming out of the city over the wall in a basket. And that's how he concluded chapter 11, because that was how weak and powerless he was to get out of that situation. So he comes to verse 7 and says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, to keep him from doing what he would ordinarily do, or someone would ordinarily do to exalt himself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, to keep me from exalting myself. I prayed 3 times, verse 8, that it would depart from me. Here's my conclusion about this first lesson. We will always have some thorn in the flesh. I guarantee you have said this at some time in your life. You may be saying it now. If only this one thing would change, my life would be perfect. I wouldn't have any problems if this one circumstance or this one individual or this one event or whatever changed or got out of my way. Everything would be fine. It's just this one thing that gets me. And if that one thing was taken away, I would guarantee you this: another thing is going to take its place. There will always be thorns in the flesh to keep us humble. It's God's way of saying you're not going to have perfection on this earth. And the lesson of the thorn in the flesh, Paul says, leads to his second point in verse 9, when God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Not only will God give us things to keep us humble, and God will break down our pride, but He gives us enough grace for what we need. Paul calls himself the chief of the sinners to Timothy. He said, no one sinned more than I, but he says, in spite of all I've done, God has shown His marvelous patience, His marvelous grace to forgive what I've done. God tells Paul, I'm not going to take the thorn away. 3 times he prays that it wouldn't leave him, that it would leave him. 3 times Jesus prayed that there be some way around the cross. Kind of some significance in that. And the answer to each of them was, no, I'm not going to change your path. I'm not going to take the thorn away. I'm not going to take the cross out of the path of Jesus. Rather, what I'm going to do is give you the grace to live with the thorn. My grace is sufficient for you. My grace is enough to work through your weakness, to work through your ineffectual speech, to work through your problems. My grace is sufficient to overcome that. Because the irony is, in a world which celebrates power and strength and wisdom and human prowess and human capability, God says, I work best through the frail brokenness of man. I don't need your wisdom. I don't need your 140 IQ. I don't need your 36 SAT score. I don't need your business prowess. I don't need you that you can bench press 250 pounds. I don't need any of that. My power is perfected in weakness. And that goes against the grain of all that we think. Because we think God will take our strongest characteristics and use those for His glory. And quite the opposite is true. God will take the weakest things we have to offer and strengthen those, fortify those with His strength through His grace, and work through that. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Nobody ever brags about how weak they are. But Paul says, I was so weak. I was led over a wall in a basket. I mean, he probably had to almost laugh when he wrote that, of how humiliating that looked. But that was a sign of God's ability to overcome that, God's ability to work through human weakness. And so he says gladly, his conclusion, verse 9, most gladly therefore, I'll rather boast about my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Sometimes we get it so wrong. in thinking that we bring to God a certain capability, and He will work through that to accomplish what He wants. I mean, all you have to do is look at Peter and John. If we had been in charge of HR of the disciples, here's what we would have done. You've got Peter, common fisherman, just a plain ordinary guy, blue collar type guy. We would send him to the rural villages to preach. And we would make his audience people who are blue collar that he would speak to. Paul, trained at the feet of Gamaliel, a Pharisee of Pharisees, a guy with a resume this long in Judaism, we would have sent him to all the learned Jews, to all the leadership of the Jews, and quite the opposite happened. God sent Paul to the Gentiles. After Peter opened up the kingdom to the Gentiles with Cornelius, then Paul concludes in his missionary journeys, God was sending me to the Gentiles. Quite the opposite of what we would do. We would send Paul to the Jews, Peter to the Gentiles, and God did it the exact opposite way. Maybe He did it so that those men couldn't brag about their prowess of who they spoke to. Now, maybe Peter would have said, I can really speak to common, ordinary people because that's the kind of guy I am. And God says, no, I'm going to send you to the Jewish leadership. And Paul, whose resume says, I can address anyone in Judaism, God says, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. Because my power is perfected in weakness. So God does things quite the opposite of what we would do. Because that's the way He operates. His wisdom, remember 1 Corinthians 1, His wisdom is so far above this world and is often contrary to the wisdom of the world, the way that God does stuff. So Paul's conclusion is, if I'm going to boast, it's not going to be about my IQ. It's not going to be about my speaking ability or inability. I'm going to boast about my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may dwell in me. So you have the lesson of the thorn in the flesh. You have the lesson of God's grace being sufficient. And then in verse 10, he talks about this lesson of contentedness, that we have a hard time accepting. He says in verse 10, because of these two lessons, the first two lessons, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Most of the time, we will complain about insults. We will gripe about difficulties. We will moan about distresses. We will throw a pity party about our persecutions. We will cry about our weaknesses. And Paul says all of those things are just fine with me. And that's not the usual human response to weaknesses, insults, distresses, persecutions, difficulties. And the key is, Paul says, when I endure those things for Christ's sake, for when I'm weak, then I become strong. So Paul says, let the weaknesses exist. Let the problems come. Let the insults rain down on me. Let the persecutions fall. Beset me with difficulties. Because God is going to overcome all of those things through His power. Not going to be through my strength, not going to be through my ability, not going to be through my wisdom, he says. For Christ's sake, I will be well content with those things. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So the things that we tend to gripe about, complain about, moan about, feel sorry for ourselves about, wish that they would be different, Paul says those are the very things we need to learn to accept. Because God can work through those for Christ's sake. He can work through those to produce strength in us when we're weak. You know, the glory of all of this, the wonder of all of this, is that God chooses to use human vessels. People who are broken, people who are imperfect, people who are weak He talks about that back in the 1 Corinthians letter, about the, maybe it's 2 Corinthians, about entrusting the power of the gospel in human vessels. He has entrusted us with the ability to take the gospel of light to those who are in darkness, but He entrusted human vessels to do that. Where's the wisdom in that? Where's the wisdom in God trusting man to do anything that He depends on us for? Because most of our history is we're pretty unreliable. We're pretty weak. We're pretty ineffectual. You know, the old story is told, somebody makes the indication of Jesus picking the 12 men to be His disciples, to be the spokesman that will take the gospel to the whole world, beginning in Jerusalem, then Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. And somebody looks at him and says, well, what if they don't do it? What if that doesn't work? What's your plan B? And Jesus says, I have no plan B. Those are the people I have chosen to do that. Jesus knew that the disciples, as human as they were, as varied as they were, you talk about 12 different guys, you look at the details of who they were, there were some people in those 12 that probably would have, in the world sense, would have killed each other. You had a tax collector and you had a political zealot. Simon the Zealot versus Matthew the tax collector. They weren't on the same side in the world in which we live. But God chose that varied group of men, even one who was a thief, and used those 12 men, even the thief, to go out and preach the gospel. We wouldn't have done that. Not in a million years would we have done that. We would have said, he's not qualified. He's not worthy. He's not trustworthy. But Jesus entrusted the gospel to those 12 as they went out 2 by 2. Eventually, Judas takes his life. He's replaced with Matthias. And those 12 men, later with the addition of Paul, took the gospel to all the known world in their lifetime because God entrusted them to do that. So the lesson, the power is that God overcomes our weakness, our inability, our tendency toward being egotistical, and says, I will do things in spite of you. I will do things through you that you can never do in and of yourself. I will bring down your pride. I will keep you from exalting yourself. I will give you all the grace that you need. My grace is sufficient for you. Verse 9, because my power is perfected in weakness. And I will bring about a person who is content with whatever happens in life. Let me tell you who we gravitate toward in life. We don't gravitate toward people who are whiners, who are gripers, who are complainers, who always have something wrong, who always have some issue, who always have something that they're focused on that is making their life miserable. Nobody wants to be around somebody like that. God doesn't use people like that. God wants us to be content with whatever happens to us in life, because through us in our weakness, He will then display His strength. So if you take away a picture of the lesson this morning, you take away the picture of the man coming down over the wall in a basket. When the valiant warrior is going over the wall, scaling it of his own strength, as the epitome of human power, the epitome of God's power is you've got a guy coming outside the wall, inch by inch in a basket. Grown man, lowered to the ground, completely at the mercy of those who are handling the ropes up above. And Paul said that is a picture of God's strength and what He can do. So quite clearly turns around the wisdom of the world with God's wisdom of what He can do in our place, in our stead. So we boast about God's grace, we boast about our weaknesses, and we allow God to humble us when we tend to exalt ourselves and think that we get the big head and we're so smart, God needs us. We're so capable, God has to have us. He can function quite well without any of us, but He would rather function through us to accomplish what He wants. So maybe this morning God humbles you. Maybe He reminds you that His grace is sufficient for you. And maybe He also teaches us the lesson that we need to be content. Quit complaining, quit griping. The things that beset us, there are always people having it worse than us. God can work through our weakness to produce His strength and to shine His wisdom and His glory. So if there's a reason you have to respond this morning, maybe something clicked with you spiritually in your mind, and you say, I need to have some prayers, we ask you to come along, stand and sing.
Bring Christ your broken life.